So if I can first then move to present Peter, who's sitting here, who is Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Liverpool and current President of the BPS. As I'm sure you're aware from his extensive publication record, his research interests are in the psychological processes underpinning well-being and mental health. He's published very widely on the role of psychological factors as mediators between biological, social, and circumstantial factors in mental health and well-being, and is very interested in the application of psychological science to public policy. So without further ado, Peter, I'll hand the floor to you.
Thank you very much. So thank you. I mean, it gives me a huge amount of pleasure to be here and to sort of say congratulations to Mike. And to an extent, some of my foxes have been shot, because I was going to have a couple of slides about some of the things that Mike have done, of which I'm very proud, I'm very envious, I'm very respectful of them. And I think that just a couple of things to say, which you know from this morning about some of the work that he's done on the psychology and the practice of anaesthesia. I quite like the fact that he was described by the Daily Mail, one of my very favourite publications, as a medical maverick. And at least out of that two-word phrase, only one of those words is factually incorrect, which is good for the Daily Mail, really, I think. And there's just a quote from what he was saying, which is about when he was doing his work on tourniqueting his arm, working as his own guinea pig, tourniqueting his arm so that the muscle relaxant didn't get to his fingers so he could still signal while anaesthetised. And the quote, which I quite like to demonstrate his bravery as well as his psychology. A tourniquet was put over my right arm and the muscle relaxant administered. I had a mask over my face to take over my breathing. The drug paralyses the breathing muscles, so if you're not ventilated, you will die. Which I think is quite a good quote from a practicing clinical psychologist. I quite like that. And my other sort of paean of praise to him is about the work that Mike has done in terms of the involvement of service users and carers in clinical psychology, but also in psychology more generally. And as I've said before, I don't think this is an easy task. So my view of psychology is that it should be a discipline and a profession that embraces quite a lot, really, from neuroscience at one end, through education, through occupational psychology, through working with the military and our armed forces, working with the police, working in mental health services, working with the homeless population. And of course, a huge emphasis on prevention as well as the intervention for people who are currently distressed. And therefore, the challenge of who is our client, who is our service user, is a difficult one because it's kind of all of us. And unfortunately, the British Psychological Society, despite our best efforts, isn't really well furnished at the moment to have lay members and members of the public embedded in what's still a member organisation. So I think Mike has done a fantastic job in moving us forward towards greater and better involvement of the public in our work, despite the fact that it's actually quite a difficult job to pursue. So I think he's been a consistent and diplomatic, but also persistent champion for the idea that our work should be values-based as well as based on our professionalism and on the science. So, yeah, I'm very much in awe of his work. However, what Mike asked us to do is to not talk about him, which is why I put a huge photograph of him on the screen, because I just thought I would ignore him, and instead talk about a vision for the future. So I shall very rapidly kick off, which I've done before. And this is a shameless plug for my book, and I've been told off for plugging my book, but I do not recommend that you go and buy my book. I recommend that you go to the nearest library and persuade the librarian to buy the book so that you can then borrow it for free. Maybe I got away with that. The first thing to say, and again I shall be brief in this, but it's important, especially because I was yet again quoted in the Daily Mail this morning, which is why I've got a Daily Mail obsession at the moment, about guild disputes and about fighting. And this is a rather unfair and underhand and ignoble point, but I didn't start the fight. So what you have here are effectively two editorials in the British Journal of Psychiatry, both written by a group of either consultant or professorial level psychiatrists, both saying that psychiatry as a profession and as a service to the public needs dramatically to change, both saying that patients will be put at risk and people will die, but also the profession will destroy itself if you do not take my course of action for the future of the profession, and completely 180 degrees opposing each other. Nick Craddock and colleagues from, I suppose you could call the traditional medical, biomedical vision, a wake-up call for British psychiatry, suggesting that what patients need is high-quality medical care to treat their illnesses. And that in that tradition you have the greatest possible benefit for the patients, you get the greatest possible separation of things that do require intervention by mental health professionals and things that don't, but also you get the protection of the bona fides of the profession of psychiatry. And in response to that, and deliberately contrary to it, you have Pat Bracken and colleagues, all psychiatrists, and all saying exactly the same thing, that in order to protect patients, in order to protect the future of the profession of psychiatry, they need to either embrace or return to a vision of the psychiatrist as a professional who understands the social and humanitarian origins of people's distress, who places people's distress in this social and lived context rather than regarding it as a disease, pathological concept that relies on working with the client in helping them discover solutions to their problems in a difficult world rather than treating illnesses. And their argument is exactly opposed to Craddock and colleagues, that the future of psychiatry is in moving away from the biomedical model. Now, it is abundantly clear to anybody who has read anything that I've ever written, even a 140-character tweet, that I am on one side of this debate. I am not neutral in this debate. I vote with Pat Bracken. But my point is that this is not psychology versus psychiatry. This is not even sociology versus psychiatry. These are different traditions of the future of mental health care. Now, this is important, I think, for us as psychologists, or for me as a psychologist, because it's into this world that I project a vision for mental health care, and then a vision for clinical psychology, a vision for psychology. And out of that, I think that I can elaborate a vision not only for clinical psychology, but for psychology in the UK. And in the grand tradition of academics, I will tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I'll tell you it, and then I'll tell you what I've told you. And I will go very briefly through this because I've elaborated it elsewhere. I've tried hard to bring down my manifesto to I think it's a 79-word manifesto. I should point out that about 3 or 4 months ago, I realised I made a grave error in this manifesto because I talked about we need to understand how other people have learned to see the world. And of course the point is this is about all of us. This is about us. This is about how I've learned to see the world. It's about how I make sense of the world. It's about how I have developed the problems that I have developed rather than you and them. But I would see our vision here as dealing with mental health problems as fundamentally social and psychological issues, replacing diagnosis with straightforward, possibly I would add to my word count by saying straightforward scientific descriptions of our problems, radically reducing the use of medication and using it pragmatically rather than seeing it as a cure for an underlying illness. It's about, in my opinion, how we've learned to make sense of the world and how we respond to it. And important to bear in mind that we need to fight for social justice and equity and fundamental human rights as we attempt to help people with particular problems. Just as a sideswipe, of course, all mental processes, even the most complex psychological processes, derive from operations of the brain, as Tom Insel, who now works for Google rather depressingly. I own a share in Google, and I tried to get Tom Insel sacked, but it didn't work. I bought my son a share in Google for doing well in his GCSEs, and it cost me 360 quid, and I bought a single share in Google, and it doubled in value. There you go. Anyway, the point here is that from this basis, the idea that our brain is the organ of affect and behaviour, the idea that complex psychological problems derive from operations of the brain, people make the leap that therefore problems with our emotions or our behaviour or our interaction with society is therefore down to problems with the brain, which of course would make sense if we were to go around violently hospitalising poets whose, of course, complex psychological problem processes, and have you ever heard poetry on Radio 4? It really is something for which something should be done. And I think because those complex and distressing behaviours emanate from operations of the brain, clearly what we need... My point is, everything that we do comes from operations of the brain. There's no particular a priori reason for suggesting that because some of our operations of the brain are ones that we at this particular moment in time decide that we want to do something about, that therefore they represent pathologies. I don't think they do. And I think that here, even in these quotes, is the argument against the conclusion itself. All mental processes derive from operations of the brain. Why are we separating out some from others? For me, I see this as how biological factors, how social factors, how circumstantial factors impact on the way that we see the world, impact on the way that we respond to the challenges in our lives. And the way that we as human beings respond to the world, of course, is dependent on, in various complicated ways, dependent on biological factors as much as on social and circumstantial factors. But the mechanism isn't that somehow there are psychological factors that release the underlying biological illness or make the underlying biological illness emerge. Rather, I think it's the case that we are, as human beings, subject to a number of things that influence the way in which we make sense of the world, the way in which we regulate our emotions. And for me, I think there's pretty good evidence, to be honest, that biological factors account for very little of the variance in the experience of mental health problems, and that social factors and circumstantial factors, the poverty, inequity, racism, child abuse and so forth into which people live, and then subsequently the way in which those people, the way in which I have made sense of the things that have happened to me in my life, it's that pathway that explains most of the variance in our mental and emotional health, rather than suggesting that differences between people in terms of mental health are primarily explained by differences between them in terms of their biological functioning. I've talked about this as a complex interactive dance of nature and nurture. That, incidentally, was a blog that got me quite a lot of comment on social media because I happened to mention the Nazis. There you go. So for me, I think that as a psychologist, my starting point is that how we think, how we feel, how we behave, our mental health is the product of the way that we've learned to make sense of the world. And that, for me, means that we should replace the concept of diagnosis with straightforward descriptions of problems. It's worth pointing out that we've done quite well in pointing that out. This is the front cover of the British Medical Journal. A colleague of mine, Mark Gabay, who's a professor of general practice at Liverpool, came into my office, threw his copy of the BMJ at me and then stormed out of my room. So I ripped off the front cover and framed it, and it's now on the wall of my office. But the high point of my career in this particular respect came a couple of years later, when I got a phone call from a colleague, Anne Cook, who said, "Are you watching The Simpsons?" And I said, "Of course I'm not bloody watching The Simpsons." And she goes, "Well, you should watch The Simpsons." And in episode 12 of series 25 of The Simpsons, there is an episode called Diggs. And Diggs is a character who has a kestrel on his arm. If any of you are old enough to remember the film Kes, he has a kestrel on his arm, and he's weird. And because he's weird, and because he's wacky, and because he's crazy, of course, Bart Simpson falls in love with Diggs. And various madcap adventures ensue, and they end up getting expelled from school, at which point Bart turns to Diggs and says, "Are you clinically insane?" And Diggs says, "The rumours of my bonkitude have been greatly exaggerated. DSM-5 indicates paranoid schizophrenia, but that work is mired in controversy." Mired. And of course I see it as my task to mire dirty things in controversy, to be perfectly honest. I don't think the controversy comes from my miring. I think that the authors of DSM-5 have mired themselves in controversy. I mean, it's worth reading if you want to know about where the miring comes from. Read James Davis's book, Cracked, about how the people who are developing DSM-5 invented and then voted on the criteria for some of these conditions. And quite outrageous quotes about, "Oh yes, we made it all up." And then moving on through life as if it somehow doesn't matter that you've made up these terms for describing people's experiences. So I think we should replace diagnosis with straightforward descriptions of problems. Describing problems, even categorizing things, is not the same as diagnosing them. So an example that I use repeatedly to try to get this point across is if I'm walking with my son and we see a bird, and I go, that, Alex, that's a seagull. That over there is a pigeon. I go, that one over there is a woodpecker. If he then turns to me and goes, Dad, why are you diagnosing the birds? It makes no sense. When you diagnose something, it means that you're ascribing the entity to a category and it carries baggage with it. So if you were to diagnose a seagull as a seagull, you are saying that the seagull is a type of illness, that the seagull's type of illness comes from a certain pathology. It fits into a medical ethos. We know what diagnosis means. Diagnosis is not the neutral classification of experiences. Diagnosis is the application of an illness model and a model of pathology, a model of professional behavior towards the seagull, a way of thinking about the concept which carries with it this biological, pathological disease model. Diagnosis is not just the neutral classification of entities. What I think we should do is simply describe scientifically, authoritatively, the things that we see. And it follows also that because I don't think that these things are illnesses, I don't think we should use medication, at least certainly not in the way that we have done up until now. And we absolutely shouldn't present it to people as a cure for the underlying disorder. And instead, we need what we would describe as psychologists as formulation, to understand why this phenomenon has occurred and to understand how people, as active agents in their own worlds, have understood the world, responded to the challenges, and developed the behavioural and emotional repertoires that they've developed, that we've developed, and tailor help to our unique and complex needs. It has some implications for us. It means that we should stop, in my opinion, talking about the 1 in 4 of us who meet the criteria for specific and diagnosable mental health problems. There isn't 75% of the people in this audience who are free from the taint of mental illness, because there is no taint of mental illness. And it is not the case that 1 in 4 of us might technically meet the criteria for a mental disorder if you were willing to subject yourselves to a system which is, I think, inappropriate and unhelpful. But I don't think we should subject ourselves to those criteria. Instead, I think all of us have emotions, all of us have responses to the world, all of us form opinions, all of us react to the situations and circumstances in which we find ourselves, and any number of us, from 0 to 100%, need help from time to time. And that's all that we've got. Describing people's experiences and describing people's problems is different, I think, than diagnosing illnesses, and suggesting that all of us from time to time need help with issues that fall into the psychological domain is, I think, perfectly reasonable. I vote with Mirabai Swingler and the Only Us campaign. I don't think there's a distinction between the mentally ill and the well. I don't think there's 1 in 4 of us who have mental illnesses. I think that's where we all live. And I think that this applies also, to move on to some of the other points in what Mike wants us to talk about. I think this relates to psychology more generally. So I think that we should avoid the concept of abnormal psychology. If I crash my car on the way home tonight and they send out crash investigators will use physics. They'll try to work out from the circumstances of the crash scene the velocity of my car. They'll weigh my car to see, well, they won't. It's a BMW 3 Series, so they'll know how much it weighs. But they might even have a look at the petrol gauge to work out how much petrol's in it so they can calculate the mass of the car. Anyway, they'll use physics to determine what was going on. They'll think about the coefficients of friction between my tyres and the road. But they won't use abnormal physics. There isn't a class of physics called abnormal physics that applies when somebody has been involved in a road traffic accident. There's just physics. And equally, I don't think there's a branch of psychology called abnormal psychology that applies when people are showing certain behaviours or certain emotions that are, in 2017 we've decided are those emotions and behaviours that fall into the broad category of illness. I think we need to understand why people do what they do. One of the antagonistic and unpleasant, and my wife would say probably argumentative approaches, is to ask people what they would do if they were working in the mental health field in 1972, when homosexuality was still classified as an illness, and then what they would do in 1974 after homosexuality had been declassified as a mental illness. And they usually say that we've moved on and become a bit more understanding of the rich complexity of human life. And then you say, well, what about schizophrenia? And they go, yeah, no, schizophrenia is definitely an illness. Yeah, but when we talk about homosexuality, yeah, it moves backwards and forwards. I don't think there's abnormal. I just think there's psychology. I don't think there's a difference between the psychology that applies to explain illnesses and the psychology that explains the rest of human life. I think there's just psychology. I also think that this has an impact on whether we're sympathetic or empathetic with people. I think this, I've got quite a long quote here from Owen Jones, who talks in politics and talks about how we feel about, especially in the things that have happened since the 20th of January, how we think about people from different social and even ethnic or religious backgrounds to ourselves. What do we do when we demonize other people? And I think that part of this response to what we mean by mental health as psychologists is to understand the innate psychology and understandability of people's emotional reactions, and therefore to empathize rather than sympathize with the situation that we find ourselves in. It also has some challenges for us, and part of my putting up these slides is, again, to think about some of the things that Mike has done in terms of the principled work that he's done in terms of having a value base to our profession. This was a photograph circulated on social media by an activist and worker in mental health care, Alison Cameron. And this is the unit's smoking area. So in order to allow people to go outside and either get some fresh air or to go outside and smoke, you build this. And it's worth pointing out, I don't need to go into details about this, but it's worth pointing out that Article 3 of the Human Rights Act in the UK, of course, we do live in a world where Theresa May has promised that she's going to abolish the Human Rights Act, but we'll move on swiftly before I can get too political. Article 3 says nobody should be subjected to torture or to inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, and the test is a very simple one, which is, would you as an ordinary member of the public feel degraded if you were exposed to that form of treatment? So would you feel degraded if you were told that you had to go outside and exercise in that? I think we collectively are breaking the law all the time in the UK, and it's shameful. So I think we need to understand the social origins of people's problems and to place our care for those of us who are suffering slightly more than the rest of us in that context of both the base of values and the social origins of mental health problems, to fight for social justice, equity, and fundamental human rights, and to establish, well, as I put it, establish the social prerequisites of genuine mental health and well-being, but I think it also means place mental health care in its proper social basis. But that has some implications, I think, and one of the things is to think about the implications of that back to, as Mike was saying, the implications for psychology and for clinical psychology. So I think one of the things to extend is, if we were to embrace that sort of a vision for what we do within the NHS, what implications would it have for how we work as clinical psychologists, and what would the implications of that sort of shift in thinking be for our profession and our discipline of psychology as a whole? If you want to think about what the implications would be for instance, psychiatry or nursing, then I think Pat Bracken's paper, Psychiatry Beyond the Current Paradigm, is probably the place to go. For me, it has these sorts of implications. So I think that there are some benefits to providing one-to-one therapy, and I think there are some clear reasons why I and others who've trained in clinical psychology will continue to work with highly distressed people broadly in mental health. But I think one of the things that we need to think about is working much more across all domains of well-being, to think about education, to think about work, to think about employment, to think about even perinatal mental health care. I think we need to actively, and I don't apologise for this, work with people like employment advisors, whether they're employed in Job Centre Plus or whether they're employed by the National Health Service, or whether, as I would argue, they would be employed by local authorities. We need to work with occupational health and occupational psychology services, working with employers. So instead of suggesting that what happens to human beings is they work productively until they become ill, at which point you bring in the occupational health people, we work as an integrated team, meaning that people are maximising their productivity and trying to make the workplaces a more emotionally nurturing environment. Do the same in schools, do the same in workplaces. So I think that we should see clinical psychologists, of course, working more closely with physical health services, working in rehabilitation, helping people who've had, for instance, coronary heart disease and so forth, become fitter and healthier and avoid future physical health problems. But I think there's all sorts of ways in which we can work across sports and leisure, with local authority services, with homeless charities and so forth, across, as I say, the full breadth of well-being. And I think the challenge there is for our employers to understand and support that move. And I think part of that, as I argue in my book, is that perhaps one of the problems is that maybe we should look towards psychologists being employed. In fact, maybe we should look to all workers in mental health being employed by local authorities rather than NHS trusts, so that we can actually employ our work to maximise the well-being of individuals and work with those other services that try to maintain health and well-being, rather than see ourselves as those people who treat illnesses. Certainly for the moment, I think our employers need to understand and support the work that we do. It's interesting that number 10 Downing Street at the moment is trying to work on an improved mental health policy because they're coming under a lot of pressure to live up to their promises. And part of that is to focus on prevention. Well, if you're going to work on prevention and you're an employee and you're working on prevention, it means you're not going to see people for whom you're offering therapies in order to ameliorate existing problems. You're going to work with schools, with kids who are at the moment not showing any signs of distress, to give them the skills such that they will never develop those problems in the future. It's one of the reasons why I'm sceptical of the use of diagnosis. My efforts are probably best placed working with people who do not, by definition, meet the diagnostic criteria for any sort of disorder, because my job is to prevent that ever becoming the case. And we need to fit that into our contracts of employment, rather than suggest if people meet the diagnostic criteria, then these highly trained people will then swing into action. We need to get in there early and before it all happens. So I think this means also that we need to integrate the work of clinical psychologists with occupational, educational, forensic health psychologists, occupational psychologists, working across all of these domains. And I think we need to unify what are at the moment disparate brands of applied psychology into a single profession. One of my colleagues, somebody who I love dearly and would always turn to for advice, and in a phone call recently, talking about something to do with the BPS, said, we were talking about political pressures on the profession, and she said, well, that's okay, Peter, that's okay. Just as long as it's okay if for instance, in this case, educational psychologists benefit. That's okay, as long as clinical psychologists don't suffer. So even within the applied psychology branches of the British Psychological Society, there seem to be infighting between these domains, and I think that's wrong. I think that's the wrong way to approach it. I think we need to unify these disparate brands of applied psychology. Basically, and yeah, I first joined the Labour Party when I was 16 years old, and ever since then, and the answer is don't fight with the educational psychologists, fight the Tories, for God's sake. I mean, we know where to place our fights. And this is where hopefully there'll be contention and disagreement between me and Mike and Bernard and others. I think we need to look at our training. Back in 2002, I suggested that one of the ways in which we might reform the profession of either psychology or clinical psychology, however you might want to think about it, and make it more suited to this sort of model of mental health and well-being, is to integrate training, especially occupational, clinical, health, educational, and forensic psychologists. And I suggested that we might actually have a generic curriculum so that we all started off training together, looking at things like ethics, looking at the social determinants of health, looking at the domains of well-being that psychologists could feed into, to look at the key psychological theories and models and evidence that pertains to our functioning and well-being across many of the domains that the Office for National Statistics assess in determining well-being on a national level. And then thinking, as we go through our training over the 3 years of doctoral training, how we might specialise and become, as we chose to be, working in the area of forensic and criminal justice, working with employers, working with children, or working in the adult care service. And for me, I think that one of the benefits of working that way would be that each of us, as we go through training, would have much more integrated exposure to other approaches. So when I would be working as a clinical psychologist, I would understand what it would be like to work as an advisor to an employer, what it would be like to work in a prison setting, what it would be like to work with a serving member of the armed forces, and what it would be like to work in schools, because that would be part of my educational experience. So my hope back then, and it's still my hope now, is that we might see greater integration of the training of applied psychologists and bringing us together as a profession. And at that point, I shall stop. So thank you very much.